Whether it's a standard over-the-counter pain relief medication for a headache or a drug to treat cancer, all must be FDA approved. This morning, we'll take a look at the so-called journey these drugs take to make it to you. Bench to Bedside begins now.
From the research bench to the patient's bedside, this is Bench to Bedside with your host, Vice Chancellor and Director of the University of Kansas Cancer Center, Dr. Roy Jensen.
Good morning. I'm Dr. Roy Jensen, Vice Chancellor and Director of the University of Kansas Cancer Center. Did you know that some drugs come from humble origins? One is a topical antifungal agent that is now being studied to treat different types of cancer. Here with me this morning to talk about how drugs are developed is Dr. Scott Weir, Director of the University of Kansas Medical Center's Institute for Advancing Medical Innovations, and Jim Baxendale, a bladder cancer survivor and research collaborator who is also with us. Welcome to both of you.
Thank you.
Jim, you have been a longtime partner with Dr. Weir in the Cancer Center. Could you tell us how you first started working together with Scott?
Sure. Yeah, it was my privilege to work with Scott and his team early on. In fact, in the formative stages of IAMI there at KU, we formed kind of our working relationship and friendship at that time. So much of the 16 and a half years that I spent directing the inventions and marketing and startups at KU, I was working closely with Scott and his team.
So Jim, my understanding is about 5 years ago, you were diagnosed with bladder cancer. Could you explain exactly what happened back then and the treatment that you underwent?
Sure. Well, it was a surprise. I was exhibiting some blood in the urine and went to my general practitioner. He said, well, we better have you checked by a bladder cancer specialist. And of course, the first call I made was to Scott, obviously a dear friend and knowledgeable in this space. And he directed me to Dr. John Taylor. At that point, I had an appointment with Dr. Taylor, and they put a camera into the bladder and saw a small tumor in there at the time. Underwent a treatment there with Dr. Taylor, and it was, like I say, about 5 years ago. I did have a lot of concerns at the time because the history, unfortunately, of cancer in my family is quite high. My mother died at the age of 33 of ovarian cancer. I was 13 at the time. Her sister, breast cancer in her mid-40s. My father, grandfathers on both sides, 2 uncles, all prostate cancer. So yes, I was a little bit hesitant, a little nervous at the time, but in great hands with Dr. Taylor.
And how are you feeling today?
Doing real well. Been cancer-free, coming up hopefully in August, be 5 years. So next appointment with Dr. Taylor is, I think about the second week in August. So we're hoping that'll continue.
Great. So we know that bladder cancer is the 4th most common cancer in men. Do we know what causes bladder cancer, Dr. Weir?
Yeah, thank you. There are 3 risk factors. The most prevalent risk factor is a long history of smoking. Secondly would be exposure to chemicals, let's say through occupation. And then the third, genetics. You know, the risk factors that are handed down from our parents, grandparents, and as Jim described, likely the cause of Jim's bladder cancer.
Mm-hmm. So, Dr. Weir, earlier I mentioned a topical antifungal agent, which is now being studied to treat a number of different cancers at the University of Kansas Cancer Center, most prominent of which is bladder cancer. How did the idea to use this particular drug as an anti-cancer agent come to you?
So with our drug discovery and development program here at the University of Kansas Cancer Center, we look for opportunities to translate laboratory and bedside discoveries that our scientists make and translate those into potential new therapeutic uses or strategies for treating and preventing cancer. One of our strategies, in addition to discovering and developing brand new drugs, one of our strategies is to look for new uses for existing FDA-approved drugs. And we call this field drug repurposing. This antifungal agent called cyclopirox, which was first approved by the FDA in 1982 and only available in topical forms to treat toenail fungus, has broad spectrum anti-cancer activity, both in the test tube and in animal models of cancer. And we seized the opportunity to make a better form of cyclopirox and administer the drug by injection. And we've moved that through the development process now into several clinical trials.
So I think, your program is a great example of how a cancer center is impacted by its research program. Could you tell us a little bit about how the bladder cancer research program at KUCC has really, changed since the start of this particular project?
Yeah, this project, I feel, has been transformational in advancing our bladder cancer research program. Through the development of this drug we're describing, which is called fos-cyclopirox, we were able to recruit Jim's physician, Dr. Taylor, from the University of Connecticut, and John is a world-leading expert in bladder cancer research and patient care. With John joining us here at the Cancer Center, it really has been a catalyst for identifying potential new ways of treating bladder cancer, designing innovative clinical trials to determine whether these investigational drugs show promise or not, and also to be able to create research tools that really can accelerate our discoveries. And in the case of the work that Dr. Taylor has done, we've established a patient registry and a biorepository, which is tumor samples collected from bladder cancer patients treated at the University of Kansas Cancer Center, which serve as research tools, valuable research tools for us to utilize.
Mm-hmm. So, Dr. Weir, you're a national expert in drug discovery and development and spent many years in the industry prior to coming on board to KU. Could you walk us through the steps of how we go from idea to actually treating a patient in the clinic with a new drug?
Absolutely, absolutely. So getting back to what I just referred to a couple of minutes ago, let's say that a laboratory researcher makes a discovery that something goes haywire within a cell. And this biological event that is associated with a normal cell transforming into a cancer cell is a step in a number of processes that machinery within cells utilize. What we think about as drug discovery and development folks, and some folks refer to as drug hunters, we think about taking that discovery and figuring out if we can make a drug that will either stop that event from happening so the normal cell doesn't go haywire and transform into a cancer cell? Or if it has transformed into a cancer cell, can we design and deliver a drug that kills that cancer cell? Now, we initially will synthesize novel chemicals. They're not drugs yet, but we will study them in the test tube and do these sorts of experiments. And as I mentioned earlier, in addition to evaluating novel compounds that aren't quite drugs yet, we will evaluate FDA-approved drugs for activity. If we can establish that a drug or a compound has activity in the test tube, we then move to animal models of cancer. And these will be either laboratory animal models that will then conduct essentially preclinical trials in animals and be able to look for evidence of activity. If we have that activity, we then focus on figuring out how can we manufacture that drug in powder form? How can we formulate that drug in powder form into a dosage form that would be easy for patients to take, and whether that's a tablet or a capsule or an injectable. And then we conduct a series of safety studies required by the U.S. Food and Drug Administration in order to advance a drug into early phase trials. We will submit an application to the Food and Drug Administration seeking clearance to test this drug in humans. And if that clearance is granted, we'll conduct early phase clinical trials. Cyclopirox is an example of that. The initial trial we conducted focused on safety. And once we established that the drug had an acceptable safety profile, we then opened clinical trials in bladder cancer patients looking for activity. If we can demonstrate activity in small numbers of bladder cancer patients and still characterizing the safety of, for example, cyclopirox, at that point, then companies, and we as well, will advance to large-scale safety and efficacy trials that will support FDA approval and launch of a new drug product.
Mm-hmm. So if you're just joining us, we're here with Dr. Scott Weir and Jim Baxendale talking about the drug discovery process, basically how a chemical compound becomes a medicine. Remember to share this link with people you think might benefit from our discussion. Use the hashtag #BenchToBedside. Now, Jim, before you were ever diagnosed with cancer, your career centered on taking lab discoveries and turning them into products to treat different diseases, including cancer. And you've really excelled in bringing researchers together to work on medical problems. Is that what your role is now that you've left the university?
Now I'm also working with entrepreneurs, other companies, not only in the region here of Kansas City, but outside the region, to identify new technologies that could be available to in-license. Some cases, an entrepreneur may be wanting to start a new company, and so we'll try to make a match for that as well. So functioning a lot as a technology scout at this point.
I see. So Jim, I'm curious if your new perspective as a cancer patient has really changed your approach to drug development and the process that these compounds go through to become a medicine.
Well, I think it's pointed out to me, the value of a program like IAMI and the ability for them to take more of a team approach in advancing a technology. They map out a development plan, they project manage the activity, bring the resources that are needed. This could be internal to KU or outside. It's just a more effective, efficient way of doing drug development. And in talking with my technology transfer colleagues around the US, they were always quite envious of me having that capability available to the tech transfer office at KU. So it just again proves that, bringing an entity like IAMI or other advisors like Scott that are skilled in that space, who can interact with an innovator and help them plan out kind of a commercial path for their innovation.
So, Dr. Weir, you lead the Institute for Advancing Medical Innovation here at KU. And that institute works with our cancer researchers to develop ideas that could potentially change the way that we treat cancer. Could you tell us a little bit about how this process is different within your institute and different in academia in general from the way things are done in the commercial world?
Sure. Discovering and developing new drugs is challenging. It certainly is challenging for the pharmaceutical industry and biotechnology companies. It's especially challenging for academia. And as you mentioned earlier, I mean, we are a leading cancer drug discovery and development program here in the U.S. And I'd like to think that we take a practical, pragmatic approach to really identifying the most promising, the highest potential discoveries that our researchers make. And then drug discovery and development is a team sport. It's not golf. And we rally teams of experts, Jim being one of them, around projects. And we guide our investigators through the drug discovery and development process and really focus on conducting experiments that are the critical go decision experiments to really help us assess whether a project has promise or not. I gave the example earlier about a normal cell, something goes haywire and it transforms into a cancer cell. We also work with investigators to identify potential markers we call biomarkers, which are chemicals, perhaps proteins, that cancer cells and tumors release that we could potentially use as guides, not only to determine whether the cancer is responding to the treatment or not, but to potentially identify which patients might best benefit from a new treatment based on how that treatment works.
Mm-hmm. So, Jim, I'm curious. You have so much experience in this space. How is working with the Institute for Advancing Medical Innovation different from the work that you've done with other groups throughout your career?
Many universities who do not have a proof of concept center like model, like IAMI, they usually engage their campus business incubator or the off-campus business incubator and in trying to work with the scientists to, in some cases, start their own company or get them some kind of connections. But what I've always noticed that you really need to work, as Scott just described, at the earliest stages of research and development to prove out the concept and help move the technology along. It's not about getting the startup formed or other business assistance. That's almost a little too early. So you need to work more closely in the R&D space to really keep the technology moving along.
So Dr. Weir, the whole story of fosacyclopirox, I think, kind of brings up some interesting differences in the way that we develop and discover drugs these days. And fosacyclopirox, to a certain extent, really began as a repurposing story. And so how is that different from kind of classic drug development and discovery? And what are the advantages for repurposing drugs as opposed to starting from scratch?
So the repurposing project with fosacyclopirox. So with that, we made a new form of cyclopirox that would enable us to give the drug intravenously. And once we do, it reaches the bloodstream and is rapidly and completely converted to cyclopirox. And cyclopirox then does its work on tumor cells. That approach, what we're able to do with an approach like that is we don't, in some cases, I described the drug discovery development process earlier. With a repurposed drug, you perhaps don't have to reinvent the wheel in some regards. Some of the early phase studies, preclinically and early phase clinical trials, you can capitalize on the work that was originally done to get that drug first approved and on the market. So in the case of fosacyclopirox, once we had synthesized that drug, we moved much more quickly into early phase clinical trials than a company is able to do with a brand new drug.
Mm-hmm. So we're approaching the end of today's show, and I've got one more question for each of you. Dr. Weir, where do you see drug discovery and development heading over the next 10 years?
There have been some really impressive developments that certainly patients have benefited from the last half dozen years or so, and I would say one of the greatest advancements has been reprogramming our body's immune systems to go out and attack cancer. And I see immunotherapy and different approaches to immunotherapy really being perhaps one of the new frontiers. Certainly, in the context of bladder cancer, our efforts are focused on not only discovering and developing promising new treatments that would be administered as single agents, but perhaps, and again, we don't know the answer to this yet, a drug like fosacyclopirox added to standard of care therapy could improve treatment outcomes. One of the challenges, bladder cancer, there are two forms. Jim was treated for what's called non-muscle invasive bladder cancer. But when the cancer invades into the muscle wall of the bladder and potentially spreads beyond the bladder, that's called muscle invasive bladder cancer. And the 5-year survival rates for the treatment of muscle invasive bladder cancer certainly are disappointing to all of us. And that really has to be a major effort of the research community, I think, over the next 10 years. Mm-hmm. We've got to improve treatment outcomes for those folks.
Great. So, Jim, obviously you've worked with academic medical centers for a very long time, and more recently you were treated at an academic medical center, namely the University of Kansas Cancer Center. In maybe a bit tangential topic to today's discussion, why should someone consider being treated at an academic medical center?
Continue to refer friends and colleagues to the KU Medical Center Cancer Center just for that reason. And I literally explain to them the difference between an academic medical center and a general hospital or physician group. In the academic medical center, there's ongoing research in different fields, obviously. And so from that research comes cutting edge drug discoveries, delivery, development, other methods of treatment. And along with that, you have researchers that are putting in new grant submissions for new areas of research. They're going to scientific conferences and exchanging information with colleagues. There's research collaborations that go on between universities, which kind of enhances both sides. So all of those things go along to kind of support the academic medical center model. So, everything is just new, it's cutting edge, it's just the latest that's happening in a field, and all of that's very important. So you can kind of rest assured when you're seeing a physician in an academic medical center, they're probably pretty much on top of their game and very informed in their particular space. So true believer in it. I think it's a good place for someone seeking, again, the latest therapies and methods. That is the place to go.
All right. Well, I want to thank both of you for being part of today's discussion, and specifically this week's episode of Bench to Bedside. To learn more about ongoing research here at the Cancer Center, visit kucancercenter.org/research. That's it for today. Join us next week at 10 a.m. for Bench to Bedside. Thanks for watching. Subscribe to our Bench to Bedside podcast, now everywhere podcasts are available.